Thank you very much, Bahram, for drawing our attention so very, very well and interestingly to the social control aspects of the laws against apostasy. Now, Roy, would you have a few words?
Thank you. I'd very much like to thank Mariam and the organisers for inviting me to this very important conference on what is, without question, one of the most important political issues that face us today. The fact that it is a political issue, I think, is not well enough understood. This is not just about religion. We're going to hear a great deal today about the oppressive and inhuman treatment of apostates, alleged blasphemers, women and non-Muslims in those states where Islam, or more correctly, those who presume to speak in the name of Islam, hold sway. So I don't intend to rehearse the innumerable crimes against humanity being perpetrated even in this country in the name of Islam or Sharia law. I want rather to try to explain what we are up against politically, from where Islamism is drawing its strength and what is driving this movement. And there are three main points I want to make. The first is this. What we're seeing in Britain today is a small part of a massively funded international campaign to impose Islamic norms and values throughout the world. Secondly, that this is a political, not a religious issue, an issue in which Islam is used both as a weapon to beat the opposition into silence and as a shield to shelter Islamist policies from criticism. But my third point, and what for me is the most important, is this. Our politicians, left, right, and centre, have failed to understand that this is a political rather than a religious issue. The Islamists are not seeking democratic change, but they're seeking to replace democracy with their religiously inspired totalitarianism. If you believe, as many Christians, Muslims, Jews, and Hindus do, that laws derive ultimately from God, then it ill behoves anyone to try to change them. These laws must be fixed irrevocably in our national constitutions, as they are, for example, in Pakistan, and as they have now become since the invasions of Iraq and Afghanistan. Of course, the long-term legacy of our invasions of those two countries is that both are now condemned to live under Sharia-based constitutions, unchangeable by normal democratic means. Now, Islam, of course, is not monolithic. Since its earliest days, there has been the split between the Sunnis and the Shias, and there's been conflict between the two, which now, after more than 1,300 years, leads to almost daily suicide bombings throughout the Islamic world. One of the most interesting stories uncovered by WikiLeaks was the request by Saudi Arabia to the United States that they should bomb Iran's nuclear facilities, as Saudi Arabia and Iran are both vying for leadership of the Islamic world. But right now it's Saudi Arabia who have the upper hand based on their oil wealth and their willingness to promote hardline Wahhabi or Salafi Islam around the world. The CIA estimated that between 1980 and 2004, Saudi Arabia spent in excess of $60 billion promoting hardline Islam in the Middle East, in Africa, Europe, United States, and Asia, in fact, around the world. That level of spending has, if anything, increased over the past 5 years. Internationally, Saudi Arabia funds the Organization of the Islamic Conference, which unites all 57 Islamic states in a single powerful bloc at the United Nations. This is the public face of Islam International, and it provides a veneer of unity based on a common belief in the supremacy of Islam, and it's also based on the money available to promote it worldwide. At the United Nations, the OIC has been behind attempts to create an internationally binding blasphemy law in the guise of combating defamation of religion, now rephrased as vilification of religion. This resolution will come up for voting in the UN General Assembly again later this month. The good news, however, is that support for this resolution has been steadily declining over the past few years. Now, before I move on to talk about how this Saudi money is influencing the political landscape in Britain, I want to draw a clear distinction between Islam and Islamism. Islamism, in the words of Amir Tahiri and as Mina has explained, it's a political movement masquerading as a religion. It feeds on our liberal democratic institutions and principles simply in order to undermine them. Yeah. We have a long and hard-won tradition of democratic liberalism in this country and in Europe in general. And we respect differences. We don't in general turn to violence to settle our political differences. And we don't expect our opponents to seek political power in order to change the system. And we are therefore ill-prepared to respond to a political movement which seeks not simply power within our democratic framework, but to overthrow democracy itself and replace it by theocracy. For many years, Europe's response to cultural and religious differences was multiculturalism, a policy that welcomed the newcomers and offered them equality in the marketplace of ideas. But how can one accept, as part of our multicultural society, a political movement that not only refuses to accept the right of others to be different, but seeks to impose its own undemocratic norms and values on the rest of us? I was delighted when the German Chancellor, Angela Merkel, recently acknowledged that multiculturalism is dead. Can we hope that our politicians in this country will wake up to this fact, with regard to faith schools, for example? The fact is that in Britain and in most of Europe, the Islamists are winning. Any criticism of Islam, of Islamic practices, or of Sharia law is greeted by cries of Islamophobia. And politicians, mindful of the Muslim vote in their constituencies, back off. The Saudi-funded Muslim Brotherhood now controls over half the mosques in France, and according to press reports I've seen, the equally hardline Deoband have taken over more than 600 mosques in Britain. Right here in London, we can see the effects of this spending. I'll give you one example. In October, the election of the mayor of Tower Hamlets was won by Lutfur Rahman by a margin of more than 2-1 over the Labour Party candidate, Hilal Abbas. Now, Mr. Rahman was standing as an independent after being dropped by the Labour Party following well-founded accusations of financial irregularities, vote rigging and corruption. But, tellingly, Mr. Rahman had the support of the hardline East London Mosque and the Saudi-funded Islamic Forum of Europe. There are several aspects of this story that the BBC didn't dwell on in its reporting on the election. One was that this was the first direct election of a mayor of Tower Hamlets, a recent change that was supported by those who have now won. Secondly, Mr. Rahman now has absolute control over a budget of more than £1 billion a year. And I leave it to you to guess what kind of organisations we can expect to benefit from his largesse. Tower Hamlets has always been one of the poorest areas of London, and from the first days of the development of Spitalfields, it's welcomed immigrants. First came the Huguenot silk weavers, Protestants driven out of France following the revocation of the Edict of Nantes. Then, at the end of the 19th century, came the Jews, driven out by the pogroms in Russia and Eastern Europe. Just 100 years ago, some areas of Bethnal Green were 80% Jewish. However, today, a borough-funded memorial to celebrate cultural diversity in Brick Lane contains only Islamic symbolism, and you will find no reference whatsoever to its recent Jewish past or to its beginnings as a haven for persecuted Protestants. I've probably spent too much time talking about Tower Hamlets and not enough about what's going on internationally. But what you're seeing here is simply one example of what's been happening in many of Europe's larger cities. Malmö in Sweden, Brussels and other major cities are becoming Muslim majority areas. Now, let me make one thing absolutely clear. I don't see this immigration as a problem per se. What is problematic is the influence of hardline Islamism, on those immigrant communities. And I can't make this point too strongly. Islamism is a political movement that is working within our democratic system in order to overturn it. Many self-appointed spokesmen, and yes, of course, it's always men, claim that the Muslim community is being unfairly singled out for blame and that we are guilty of Islamophobia. But the hostility to Islam, which I certainly recognize is on the increase, it did not arise in a vacuum. There is no equivalent hostility towards the Hindu religion, for example. The hostility towards Islam arose as a reaction, among other things, to the behavior of some young Muslims on our streets, such as those who demonstrate in support of suicide bombers or against the bodies of soldiers returning from Afghanistan. Young Muslims suffer from high levels of unemployment, partly because they're being taught that Islam must take precedence over the normal activities of daily life. Many are taught to hate our society and its values, to hate women's equality, democracy and freedom. And what non-Muslim Europeans are now feeling is a reaction to that extremism. I suggest it's not Islamophobia, an irrational fear of Islam, but Islamo-nausea. We need to be far more nuanced in our response to this. What we must do is oppose the far-right vilification of all Muslims just because they're Muslim. Our reaction must be to oppose extremism, but in the name of equality, freedom, and democracy. We must recognize that it is Muslims themselves, and especially Muslim women, who are the first victims of Islamism. We must work by every legal means to uphold their rights to equality and autonomy, and we must fight every inch of the way against those who would deny them. And to do this, we need to engage with our politicians. We need mainstream politicians to take up this issue, and it takes courage to expose Islamism for what it is, a pernicious, totalitarian political movement, as much a threat to our liberal democratic society as was fascism in the 20th century. Thank you.